The cicadas screamed across the valley as dawn broke over Edo, the rising sun painting the tiled rooftops with crimson fire. Within the barracks of Lord Takeda's estate, rows of armored men stirred from restless sleep, their futons rolled tightly, their swords laid neatly at arm's reach. These were the samurai, men born into honor, bound by oath, and tethered to a life both revered and merciless. To the villagers who glimpsed them riding through the narrow roads in lacquered helmets and silk banners, they were living gods, embodiments of discipline and power. But behind the polished steel and the layers of myth, the life of a samurai was a relentless grind of hardship, fear, and sacrifice. Young Hiroshi, no more than 17 summers, rose stiffly from his mat. His fingers brushed the cold hilt of his wakizashi, the short companion blade that marked his station as much as his katana. Today was no festival of triumph. It was another day of survival in a world where loyalty could turn to death as quickly as a master's whim. "On your feet, Hiroshi," barked Kenji, an older retainer with a scar dragging across his cheek like a canyon. "The Lord expects us at the training yard before the incense burns down." Hiroshi swallowed his fatigue and followed. The yard smelled of sweat and pine resin, the ground packed hard by years of footwork drills. The samurai gathered in silence, their faces masks of stone, but their eyes, haunted, weary, betrayed the toll of endless repetition. Hours of striking wooden posts until palms bled, hours of mounting and dismounting horses until thighs ached, hours of chanting codes of conduct until the words lost meaning. It was not glorious, it was grueling. And above them all, etched into the very marrow of their existence, was bushidō, the way of the warrior, obedience without hesitation, sacrifice without question, death without fear. But reality did not match the scrolls. Reality was hunger gnawing at bellies when stipends were late. Reality was kneeling in snow to await a lord's judgment, praying it was not the order to slice open one's own belly in ritual suicide. Reality was the constant dread that a single mistake, a poorly phrased word, a failed strike in practice, could bring not only disgrace, but annihilation. As Hiroshi swung his blade again and again at the straw dummy, sweat stinging his eyes, he thought not of honor, but of survival. Each strike was less about glory and more about keeping the rice bowl filled for another day. Yet even in this brutal life, stories whispered through the night fires of spirits haunting the battlefield, of vengeful Yurei dragging dishonored warriors to the underworld, of Oni stalking those who abandoned their code. Whether real or imagined, the folklore bound itself to reality, twisting the hardships of life into tales that made sense of the suffering. And Hiroshi wondered, was he living for his lord, for his code, or merely for the next sunrise? By mid-morning, the Lord's herald beat a drum until the echo rattled the barracks shutters. Men fell into line, blades at hip, heads bowed. Lord Takeda appeared at the veranda in layered brocade, his posture a blade honed on ceremony. A kneeling peasant couple trembled at the stone steps, their faces streaked with dust. The woman's sleeves were empty, the stump of an arm hid beneath crude bandage. Beside them, a boy 8 at most, clutched a wooden charm etched with a fox's tail. "Bandits," Kenji murmured, "again." Takeda's voice carried like cold water. The storehouse at Seki was raided, 6 sacks of rice stolen, 2 men cut down. The villagers look at us. Justice is our rice bowl. He let the words hang. Hiroshi. Hiroshi stepped forward, his mouth tasted of iron. "My lord. You will retrieve the rice and the heads of those who took it. If you cannot find their heads, bring me the hands that wield blades." The boy with the fox charm stared at Hiroshi the way a starving dog stares at bone. It was not reverence, it was hunger weaponized into expectation. Hiroshi's guts clenched. Justice is our rice bowl. The phrase lived inside every samurai, so did the unspoken addendum, and when the bowl is empty, we eat shame. Kenji clapped his shoulder. "I will ride with you." They departed with 4 more men. On the road, cicadas screamed, and pine shadows striped the dirt like bars of a cell. Hiroshi kept his eyes on the ruts left by heavy carts. Bandits who steal rice do not vanish, they feed. In the ravine near Seki, they found a small shrine blackened by fire and a trail of chaff leading into cedar groves. Dusk pooled between trees. Kenji raised a hand. Listen. A hush, then laughter, a thin, exhausted cackle. Hiroshi slid from his horse and moved low, the way he'd been drilled, heel, toe, breath a thread. Through the brush, he glimpsed 3 men around a cookfire and a 4th, bare-shouldered and fevered, scraping burnt rice from a pot. Not Ashigaru deserters, not brigands, farmers wearing swords like borrowed thunder. Hiroshi's breath thinned. Starved men in stolen armor, they'd taken the rice to live. He remembered his mother pulling tatami straw to burn through a winter week when stipends lagged. He remembered the smell. Kenji whispered, "We strike before they scatter." "Wait," Hiroshi murmured. "They are peasants, if we bring back the rice and spare." Kenji's hand tightened. Our Lord did not ask for opinions. The 4th farmer coughed, and all at once the moment broke. The men around the fire saw glints of steel in the leaves. They leapt up, not to fight but to run. Steel answered anyway. Kenji moved like a blunt god, his blade crushing a shoulder. Hiroshi intercepted another, dragged him down in a tangle of limbs. "Please," the man gasped. "Children." Hiroshi could feel the man's ribs against his forearm, a lattice fence around a famine. In the underbrush, pale paper charms fluttered from twigs, foxtails drawn in childish loops, offerings to Kitsune for luck, folklore against hunger. Reality cut the thread. "Hands," Kenji said, voice flat. "Our Lord wanted hands if heads are messy." Hiroshi stared at his blade. Its edge waited like an answer he didn't want. The farmer's eyes were huge, swallowing stars. "Kenji," he said, "let me take the rice back. They will starve without." "We are not granary keepers." Kenji lifted his sword. It would have ended in a slick, red commitment to obedience, if not for the rustle in the trees and the sudden stamping of hooves. A shout split the dark. A dozen figures burst from the grove, bandits this time, real as wolves, some with spears, some with kitchen knives lashed to bamboo. The grove exploded into chaos, sparks and screams. Hiroshi held the farmer down through the first impact and then rolled, blade flashing. The world became breath and angle, the prayer of training, cut, step, turn, guard, until the ravine reeked of wet iron. When it ended, Kenji stood over a heap of quiet. 2 samurai bled out near the fire. The farmers had fled into shadow, dragging one of their own. The stolen rice had spilled into the dirt, becoming white stars ground into mud. Kenji wiped his blade on his sleeve and looked at Hiroshi. "You hesitated." Hiroshi swallowed. "I saw men." Kenji's scar pulled. "I saw thieves." He kicked the ruined pot. "Our Lord will dine on explanations tonight. Bring what rice you can salvage. And a hand," he added, voice colder than river stones. "One will do." Hiroshi stared at the corpses and thought of the boy with the fox charm. He knelt, and the story that would haunt him began with the sound of his own breath, counting cuts he would never forget. They returned at dawn under a dim sky. The estate roused to receive them with the brittle ceremony of duty. A single severed hand lay wrapped in cloth at the foot of the veranda. The band of salvaged rice, filthy with soil and blood, sagged in the arms of 2 servants who would rinse it until the water ran clear. Lord Taikta regarded the hand without flinching. He did not ask if it belonged to a bandit or a peasant. A samurai's report was a sword, to be presented sharp, not argued dull. "You hesitated," he said at last, eyes on Hiroshi, not a question. Kenji had already spoken. Hiroshi placed his forehead to the boards. "I did, my lord." "Why?" "They were hungry." Silence peeled the air like old paint. Somewhere, a wind chime ticked. "And you?" the Lord asked. Hiroshi blinked. "My lord." "Are you hungry?" Hiroshi's thoughts scattered. He had eaten barley gruel with a pickled plum for months now. His stipend barely stretched. He paid a calligrapher to teach him characters in the hope of being moved to the clerk's room, one less sword between him and hunger. "Always, my lord," he said. Taikta's hand moved like the flick of a fan. "We are all hungry. Men are not wolves because their bellies ache. The code is the leash that keeps us from tearing each other out of the world." Hiroshi pressed his forehead harder into wood until he smelled sap, old and bitter. "Yes, my lord." Kenji, Taikta continued, discipline him. Kenji bowed. The punishment was merciful as such things went. 100 strikes with the flat of a bamboo shin, spaced so that none would cripple, delivered in the training yard for all to see. Mercy was a public spectacle in samurai lands. Word spread by noon. Hiroshi knelt bare-shouldered on the packed earth while the sun crawled toward its cruelest hour. The men gathered around with stone faces and fidgeting hands. A servant unstoppered a jar of vinegar afterwards to keep infection from the welts. It was a good estate. They preserved even as they were punished. Kenji stepped forward, eyes steady. You can curse me if you need to, he said softly. I won't, Hiroshi answered. The first strike fell. Pain flowered and then lived in his lungs, a burning animal that dragged its ribs across his breath. By 20, the world had narrowed to sound. The whistling rush, the flat slap, the hiss of men remembering their own. Near midnight, a scream cut through the rain. Men scrambled, blades loose. A sentry lay near the tea-house gate, throat open. Not a bandit's cut. Something cleaner. An officer shouted to tighten the perimeter. Lanterns swung, sluicing light over bamboo, mud, startled frogs. At the edge of the light, a shape moved, slow, deliberate, human soon enough. A woman in white, hair unbound, clothing wet, yet somehow not soaked. She walked between men as if their lanterns were reeds she could part. Hiroshi stood without knowing he had, mouth dry. Kenji hissed, "Don't." The woman stopped at the tea-house threshold. Her face was pale as a peeled bamboo shoot, but her eyes had the deep lake darkness Hiroshi remembered. She lifted an empty hand, and the rain, for the span of a breath, seemed to ring. Whose death? An officer barked, because samurai believed all things could be interrogated into obedience. The woman smiled in a way that made Hiroshi colder than rain. Yours, she said, without moving her mouth, or perhaps the thunder said it for her. Then she was gone, not vanished as a trick does, but receding like a boat that was never there. They found the sentry's killer in the morning, a deserter from Hosokawa's ranks, mad with fever, who had stumbled into their watch like a fox into a snare. The clean cut belonged to a surgeon's knife in his belt. He died babbling about a lady with ringing sleeves. Reality offered its dull rationalities. Folklore sat in the corner and smiled with sharp teeth. The first clash with Hosokawa's vanguard happened on the third day, in a valley shaped like a bowl that would catch blood as easily as rain. Flags stabbed the sky. Drums called men into the math of death. Hiroshi had dreamed of his first battle many times. None of the dreams had included the smell, horse, sweat, wet leather, the rich copper bite beneath all of it that promised what was coming. Taikta arrayed his men in a crescent, Ashigaru with spears at the teeth, archers behind, samurai as the roving knife to carve where the lines softened. Hiroshi stood on the right with Kenji, a banner snapping above them. Breathe, Kenji said, as if Hiroshi might forget. A boy at Hiroshi's left vomited quietly, wiped his mouth, and set his feet again. Courage was often a thing that stood up smelling like bile. The first wave came like weather, Hosokawa's spears jogging down the slope, faces tight, feet sure. Arrows rose and fell, a dark rain that stripped leaves from men. A spear line is a hedge of promises. To break it, you must decide you are a storm. Taikta's Ashigaru met the hedge with their own thicket, wood cracking, men crying out. Kenji signaled, and the samurai surged along the flank. Hiroshi found a seam, slid through it, and became what he had trained to become, angles and weight, cuts that spent breath like coins, turns that made enemy blades into invitations. He was alive the way a bell is alive when struck. He split a spearhead. He opened a man from shoulder to collarbone and saw, to his dismay, that the man's eyes were the same frightened dark as the boy with the fox charm. For a time, the world narrowed to a series of questions with answers written in steel. He answered enough of them to still be standing when the vanguard broke and ran back toward the ridge. Shouts rose, Taikta pushing advantage, Hosokawa's flank buckling. Then a horn call split the din in an unfamiliar pattern, and riders burst over the ridge, cavalry, armored heavy, the ground groaning under the surprise. Taikta's crescent flexed and almost broke. Shock rolled through the ranks like a thrown stone circles. Hiroshi turned to meet hooves with a heart-hammering yes and no at once. A horse's nostrils flared in his face. Kenji knocked him aside, a hoof flashed where his knee had been. Kenji's blade hooked into a rider's stirrup strap, yanked, and man and beast separated into struggling flesh. Hiroshi stabbed up into the open seam and felt his blade grind against spine. It was a nasty, intimate sensation, like pulling a splinter of God out of the world. When it ended, it didn't end. The cavalry fell back, reorganized. Takeda's officers shouted men into new shapes. Drums argued with horns. Hiroshi's hands shook only after he realized they were his again. On the ridge, a lone figure stepped into view, a standard bearer, perhaps, or a fool. White cloth flapped around her like a storm that had forgotten its reign. She lifted one arm, and the light on the valley floor went a fraction colder. Hiroshi shut his eyes and opened them. The woman in white was there and not there, as if his mind offered her as a footnote to whatever the ridge actually held. "Stop looking at ghosts," Kenji barked, and shoved him toward the reforming line. They held. By afternoon, Hosokawa's vanguard had had enough. The valley kept its bargain with blood and let the rest go. Crows arrived like accusations. Men limped, sat, muttered thanks at idols made from twigs. Hiroshi washed his blade in the stream and watched Red Ribbon away toward a rice field that would taste of iron this season. That night, the camp smelled of boiled millet and poultice. Men told each other calm lies. Kenji sat with Hiroshi under a tarred cloth and laced his fingers. "First battle," he said. Hiroshi nodded. The nod felt like it belonged to someone remote. "I killed a man who had my eyes." Kenji's scar looked deeper by the firelight. "That is the truth of it. We fight men we might have been if someone else had eaten our rice." "Do the Yurei come for them?" Hiroshi asked before he could stop himself. Kenji considered. "They come for the ones who look back while walking forward. They come for men who believe two things at once." Hiroshi laughed without humor. "Then I have a banquet." Kenji's mouth twitched. "So am I," he said, and poured them both into another dipper of thin wine. After the valley, Takeda's army didn't chase glory, it chased supplies. War is a river that runs on food. They moved like stubborn weather along back roads, trading steel for sacks of rice, favors for quiet crossings. Hiroshi hauled crates, wrote requisitions, bled in non-mythic ways from rope burns and saddle sores. The stories told in city teahouses rarely include the clatter of lids and the arguments about counting. One night they quartered in a village whose well had a reputation. If you dropped a coin and it rang against an unseen stone, a spirit would answer one question, provided the questioner had taken no life. Hiroshi did not drop a coin. The well would be silent for him. The thought soured his mouth, and he drank anyway. A week later, news rippled through camp. A senior retainer had been caught skimming rice from the levee and selling it back to desperate villagers at triple tithe. Lord Takeda sentenced him to seppuku at dawn. Honor would be satisfied. Rice would be counted. The story would walk back to the capital wearing clean sandals. Kenji was appointed kaishakunin, the one who ensures the dying ends quickly. He accepted with a face that said nothing and an extra layer of quiet. Before the ceremony, Hiroshi found him under the shade of a dead pine, oiling his blade with methodical care. The world around them smelled of damp straw and waiting. "Do you hate him?" Hiroshi asked. Kenji slid the cloth down the steel. "Does a farmer hate the ox he must slaughter?" He glanced up. "It isn't hate that matters, it's a skill." At dawn, the condemned man washed, dressed, and knelt before a low table. He was neither trembling nor serene. He was a man exiting a door he had opened himself, face set in an expression of bureaucratic regret. The witnesses gathered. Lord Takeda watched with a gaze like a ledger column. The retainer wrote a final poem. "I counted rice then. The number counted me back. Autumn moon, half full." He placed the paper aside, slid his wakizashi from its sheath, and pressed it to his belly. He met Kenji's eyes and inclined his head, ready. Kenji lifted his sword, exhaled, and cut. It was clean, it was terrible. It was the most intimate stroke a man could deliver for another. The head did not roll. Kenji caught it in cloth before it could touch dirt. Witnesses exhaled. Take-da nodded. The retainer's body bled into the ground with the small sound of spilled tea. Hiroshi did not vomit, a small triumph. He did, however, see the woman in white standing just behind the witnesses, face unreadable as a sealed letter. She extended one sleeve toward Kenji in a gesture that was not quite blessing and not quite blame. Afterward, Kenji washed his hands in the river until his skin went raw. Hiroshi stood beside him and watched the water carry the thin pink downstream. "Does it get easier?" he asked. Kenji stared at his palms. "Practice makes a better cut. It does not make for a better sleep." They walked back through fog. Somewhere, a fox barked. Hiroshi thought of the fox charms in Seki, of the boy's huge eyes. The world is a paper screen. Every day, he discovered new ways to rip it. That evening, a rumor snaked through camp. Hosokawa's lord had died of a fever. The campaign would wind down. Men shifted between relief and disappointment as if trying on coats. Samurai long for battle until battle is offered like stale bread. Then they remember they prefer rice. Take-da called his men and spoke of honor, restraint, the strength of walls built of obedience. He distributed merit, small coins, extra measures of millet, praise printed on tongues. Hiroshi received a token and felt both seen and sentenced by it. The army turned homeward. On the road, they passed fields whose scarecrows now wore bits of armor scavenged from the valley. The crows had learned new perches and new grammar for their cause. Hiroshi rode with his eyes on the horizon and the knowledge that his life had been yanked a few inches out of its old shape, never to return. Back at the estate, the war's pageant folded itself into peacetime obedience. The barracks adopted a rhythm, drills at door.